Ceaculóir Ghaoiniúsle, Crumitúsle, Imirce Léineo, Fáilte Astra Ghuilne, So we're going to start this morning with Dr. John Cunningham's talk now. John has some very interesting material, visual material on the computers. So we have two computers set up there where people can have a look, and you can scroll up and down on the PowerPoints, which he's prepared for the material. We haven't got a screen here, but this PowerPoint will be mixed in with the version which we're going to put up eventually on the Galilliam and Tom O'Flaherty Society YouTube. So, John Cunningham, Dr. John Cunningham, Cara leis a gomann seo déan rá léachtóir in Ollscoil na Gaillimhe, agus tá aine baint ige mar chun bhíonn sa scríb faoi staraí star na Geart Chumann agus an staráitiúil. An go leor fáil si ige leabhar dafa chéin, leabhar chu sin neagar, agus bhí sin neagarthóir feascatha iris starlochtaid an héireann an tíris saothar. Agus sin leabhar stearmaí atá tacaí ó John imlíon na hain le Terry Dunn, in Cruiseach Spirit of Revolution, Ireland from Below, 1970 to 23, Four Courts Press, Seolú níos tuaisce mbliana. So John Cunningham of UCG is now happily retired, or just about.
Another week.
And he's going to have a very active retirement.
Yes.
I did. He didn't tell me that. I'm just telling him, promising him that. I'm sure he will be in any case, because John is he's a very active historian, as we're saying in Irish there, historian of labour, trade union history and local history. Among his publications in local history is the book Galway, A Town Tormented by the Sea. I thought they were tormented by the O'Flahertys in the old days, but Tormented by the Sea is the title, 2004. And he was editor for a spell of fhir, the Journal of Irish Labour History. And John's specialisation is the history of working class and ordinary people, and that's the angle of his latest publication, co-edited with Terry Dunn, Spirit of Revolution, Ireland from Below, 1970-23, a collection of very interesting essays about that period as seen from different organisations, civil society organisations and trade union and other perspectives. Agus to John Obair agus Golbhú Scéal Batha Tom Glynn. We're talking about the O'Flahertys today. John's talk is going to be a comparison between Tom O'Flaherty, Tomás, and Tom Glynn, a man from nGoirtín in East Galway. John's been working on his biography, and it's nearing completion. Tom Glynn is a figure quite similar in many ways, as you're going to see, very similar to Tom O'Flaherty. They lived in pretty much the same period, and they were both, we'll say, very strong socialist journalists and activists, and they were both, I suppose, mavericks or unconventional figures in certain ways. Both were very strong militants with, as the theme of our weekend was, both had a broad international perspective, born in certain cases, while Liam O'Flaherty's perspective was born of his war experiences. Tom from travel, and Tom O'Flaherty from travel, Tom Glynn also lived in Australia, and he was also in South Africa. So these are figures who went outside Ireland, who had a big world perspective on things. Now, I don't want to have too many spoilers. You'll see the similarities, as John has nicely laid out in his PowerPoint, the various similarities and parallels between these two figures. Tom O'Flaherty, Ruguncha and Orin from Inishmore, and Tom Glynn from East Galway. So two Galway men and two quite similar figures. So we're very grateful to John for taking the trouble to come out here, and he's done some interesting research in preparation on both figures, and come up with a few interesting items on Tom O'Flaherty as well. So chuir sé seo leis an eolas atá bin Tomás Ó Flaithearta go háirid, agus chuir sé beidir perspective agus cóhéics níos léine, dúir sé cóhéics níos léine chuaigh maidir le Tom, ní cinál dineisceachtú na rud éonar bhí a Tom, bhí go leor éir níos an am sin in Moisiad Ceart chum in party Cumanach a timpeall a domhnaí lug, agus is seo beirt acu mar deartha tá anchosú le chéile. So gan hile moile dhéanamh fach mé faoi John, bei ceistnaí an bei se caint agus ben an chaint sa dáhang agus bei ceistnaí an mas fáile.
Okay. Good media. I think that's all, really. Sulla dosi me I gceart ceap me go meach sé arúnach pí a scríomh nóireachta chud Tom a chur os war góir tá sé sa ríomhara an sin agus banan sé le téim na Féile idirnáisiúnachas na bhleathirteach agus dar nó tá sé topicúil sa chuí a déalálann sé leis a Balistine. Cuimhnig gur scríomh Tom an pí seo beagnach céad bhliain ó hin. Is sampla maith é freisin de scríomhnóireacht Tom Ó Flaithearta. Idir stíl agus ábhar a scríomhnóireacht politiúil. Tá sé tráthúil agus tá sé granmhar, irreverent díortha. Agus tá sé typiciúil freisin dá colún sa Daily Worker, as we see it, a fáilsiú dús sa Daily Worker, agus lean Tom leis sa Producers News I Montana, Jerina Fichiad. So, Lees duine heile as an river. Mary. Yeah. On peace atá an céad níl sé rád bhfuil.
There's much wailing and counter-wailing over the minor war in Palestine, which had its inception in a fatal riot between Jews and Arabs under the Wailing Wall of Jerusalem, where for centuries Orthodox Jews from all parts of the world have pilgrimaged to kiss the stones and mourn departed glories. They claim that the Wailing Wall was once part of Solomon's temple. On the other hand, the Muslims claim their prophet Muhammad ascended from some spot near the Wailing Wall. When Palestine was under Turkish rule, the Arabs and Jews worshipped their respective gods and prophets in peace and amity. The Jews could wail all they liked, provided they didn't wake the Arab babies at night. But when the doodlebugs of the British Empire discovered oil in the Holy Land, and British military experts discovered that the Palestine was located in a strategic spot on the road to India, Great Britain declared that the unspeakable Turk must no longer remain in possession of the cradle land of the Christian religion, despite the fact that the Jews are somewhat cold to Christianity, to put it mildly.
Okay, well, sin písa Tom ó níide fihanní. So, sé cosbar na písa canse seo ná Tom Flaherty mar a dúirt éama na choirí gomperáid le Tom Glynn fear eile as condana Gaillimhe a bhí ar cóis leis. Bé mé déanamh an comparáid maidir le idirnáisiúnta, le gníomhachas agus le n-iriseoireacht. Tá betheisnis Tom Glynn idir lábha agam mar a dúirt éaman so mé sa saineolaí mé ar saoil Tom Glynn. Ní féidir ileithead rá fhí maidir le Tom Flaherty. Thosa mé déanamh taidir cúpla mí ó hin nuair a fuair mé an cura ó éaman. So chuid daoine éagsúla leom leis a méid atá déanta agam éaman féin, seos fó Chuaigh tá san ospidéal faoi láthair, Jenny Farrell, Morris Casey, agus an Dram Hall I leabharlann Hesburgh I Notre Dame in Indiana. Fuair mé, tá ólas freisin an I tráchtas a scríomh Genevieve Faherty as an Ileán seo in Ollscoil na Gaillimhe beidir timpeall deimhlíon ó hin. So is anordam a bheith an chore a bheith an seaniuh agus gan buchas leis an common as. Mar dúirt éaman is choirí láthair dáthangach I seo, so bei mé ag ahrú ó Gaeilge go béir agus a reis. So we're talking about two men who left the west of Ireland at a time of great change in the world. great concentrations of capital, increasing exploitation of workers, great movements of people from countries around the world to the settler colonies, in particular the United States, Australia, and South Africa, and so on. So these two individuals were moved by, I suppose, what they saw, but also influenced perhaps by their backgrounds, by their characters and so on, to try to do something about it. So they threw in their lot with the social justice movements of the era, which were generally, they gravitated towards what movements, syndicalist, socialist movements, and so on. They wrote in order to change the world. They were both journalists, but they weren't arguably journalists first. They were revolutionaries first, and they wrote in order to persuade others to join them in the struggle for a better world. And it was literally a better world that they sought rather than a better country here or there. They linked the plight of people in one country with those exploited in others, and they believed that change had to be brought about by cooperation among working people and so on in developed and underdeveloped countries. So they wanted to bring down capitalism. They agreed on that much. But they didn't think it could be done piecemeal, just thus the organisations they joined generally had an international character. In North America, in South Africa, in Australia, they worked readily with people of other ethnic backgrounds and also with the native born of those places, and they adapted ideologies developed in other places to the local circumstances in which they found themselves. In South Africa and in Australia, Tom Glynn advocated a version of industrial unionism, which was advocated by the industrial workers of the world, a Chicago-based organisation. So the Wobblies, as they were called. So he wasn't bound by Australia. He found an ideology which were developed elsewhere. Later, he espoused Russian Soviet communism. Tom Flaherty, too, became a prominent communist, spent periods in Moscow on communist business, and took part and took sides in a bitter controversy which originated in the Soviet Union. And thus, in December 1928, he declared himself a supporter of the left opposition, a Trotskyist, one of the very first to claim that designation. During 4 years in prison, just to underline the international kind of character again, Tom Glynn taught himself French in order to better, this is a guy who left school at 11 or so, in order to better interpret the ideological debates that were going on in the socialist movement. Mostly these two wrote for small circulation socialist, syndicalist and labour papers. These were often publications which struggled from one issue to the next. And they struggled also to pay their writers and to pay their editors, indeed. And as well as writing for such titles, Glynn was editor of titles in Australia, in South Africa and Australia, and O'Flaherty of titles that we know in America and Ireland. Papers like Direct Action in Sydney and the Daily Worker in Chicago, not working? Don't be pulling at it. Okay. Okay. Papers like those, the papers they were involved with, were seen as essential to the movements they were involved with. A left-wing organisation without a regular newspaper, publication, periodical, wouldn't be taken seriously. And it was an argumentative and an often dogmatic milieu, and papers like these allowed the ideologues, the leaders of these movements, to set out their differences with other organisations, which obviously were wrong, and so on. So it's quite combative type of milieu. They also acted, these papers acted as point of contact for prospective members. The more successful of the papers combined ideological rigour with humour. And there was generally a cartoonist to poke fun at the bosses and all of their minions, the priests and the politicians and whoever else were seen to be in league with them. Tom O'Flaherty and Tom Glynn were successful as writers because of their capacity to write pithily and humorously. And if being a journalist in this milieu was precarious economically, it was also risky in other ways. Just to kind of digress a little bit, I think there's a slide of the Haymarket martyrs somewhere there among the others. The four people executed in Chicago in 1887, cause célèbre of the labour movement. Four of them, they were all editors of radical newspapers as well as everything else. And there's a connection between one of the executed men in 87, this cause célèbre, and our two heroes today. Albert Parsons, who was one of those executed, was married to Lucy Parsons, who was a founder of the IWW, the Wobblies, and indeed Tom O'Flaherty worked closely with her in labour defence in the 1920s. So this history is still alive in 30, 40 years later. With regard to Glynn, he faced a treason charge in 1916 with the prospect of execution for his anti-war journalism. He got off with 4 years in jail, ultimately. O'Flaherty had his own brushes with the law. He was one of the Bridgeman, Michigan prisoners in 1922. There's a picture there of that, following a raid on a secret meeting at which he was attending. Ultimately, he wasn't convicted, though some of the others were. So Gaillimhe and I anish le cúlra an bheirt. So tógu Tom O'Flaherty, though is agah I dteaghlach de déanir póiste I nGoirtín gapal áran. Tíomh na Flaherty, bhí muintir Sean Vonithe I nGoirtín gapal, a chánig muintir a bháthair na Ganleys as éintrama since the 1850s. Marall an gúlra sin is dócha bhí an teaghlach bá hangach cé gur gailge bháin a leabhar formhór phobal áran ag an am. Teach folitiúil a bhí an le linn óige Tom agus ribhe sin fiú. Bhí Mike Víhil ó Flaithearta agus drecháiricha céile na Ganleys chun tosaí I ngníomhachtaí conra na talún agus ghluaiseachtaí talmhaíochta a leanna agus bhí ceangat leis a finíachas freisin. Le linn óga Tom bhí beirt páirsa hábhachta I síl an phobal a tháinig ó lasmuich den Ileán. Ba as an éil contemporaries an tathair ó Farachar agus sagart paróiste agus as limni a tháinig máistear scoile David O'Callaghan. Bhí bant ach ag an beirt le bunú conra na Gailge Áirden ghluaiseacht eile a bhí suntasach do bhaintear I Labhairte. Nuair éirí námhdeas idir an sagart agus an máistear bhí déalt mór an Ileán inar thóg na Flaherty tíomh an máistear scoile. Détá rá gur teaghlach eisceachtúil nó neamhgnách a bhís na Flahertys, organic intellectuals sa híl léirí Antonio Gramsci. Rénos bhí éideachas meán scoile tábhachtach sa teach mar bhí éideachas meán scoile ag chuigar den teaghlach greifúracha agus greithir Tom. De réir a chuntas féin curú cosc Tom dul go coláiste Summerhill I sligach mar gur chur an tair ó fearachar bach dul an. Now rugú Tom Glynn I máile fearan an clach in aice le sráidbhaile Gurtín, timpeall Labhair idir Béal na Slua agus Bailán Rí. Bhí ahar John ina cuireara, a herdsman, I measc pobl de mórí begad an cuideas mó. Cáil Tom Glynn a bháthir, nuair a bheith sé dámh líon díos, George Aifric Theas gníomhach. Could I say that? Get that right. Agus í ag súil páiste. Bhí drethúr agus drethúr a bháin níos sinne ná ag Tom agus bhí cúgar páiste eile ó ghara fós John Glynn ó ahar. Bhí ghluaiseacht na talún bríomhar sa cheantar cosú leis a chuí a bhí sé ar áran ach rinne slí bathe John Glynn rudí Jackar dó, captar marial ar an chuí go raibh sé ag obair na tíorna talún agus lehéad go raibh sé ar tíomh na tíorna talún sa chomhlint a bhí ar siúl. Brac Gaeltacht a bhí I ben nGoirtín áitirá Gailge ag na seanbíine ach béarla bhó a bhí ag glún Tismaitheoirí Tom Glynn. Chuimhní iníon Tom, Molly Glynn, I Sydney, go rúsáid sé nachanna Gailge ar feachíl agus go raibh seo bródúil as an méid Gailge a bhí aige. Bhí spalpíní ó Connemara, I gceantar Gurtín le lína óige nach ra mór an béarla acu agus cailíní amsere chamáiliob. De réir Seán McGillar ná brethebh agus béileidesóir a bhí an amach siopadóra I nGoirtín agus cóis le Tom Glynn a dólam sesin a chuid Gailge ó chalín amsere sa teach. Fear umráit eilech ó Gurtín an martíreach an Father Michael Griffin, cé go raibh sé níos óga nó Tom Glynn nó McGillar ná. Dreastal Tom ar an scoil áitiúil, Temple National School, ach is minic a bhí sé as láthair. Béidir go raibh sé ag cuidiú lena ahar, nó béidir go raibh an scoil neamhchompórtach de duine le a bhí bainse leis a herding agus mar sinne. So at 17 then, just 17, Tom and his 19-year-old brother left Gurtín for Melbourne. Two uncles and an aunt had gone before and cousins of his father. Others of previous generations of the Glynns had gone to America. Tom's arrival in 1899 coincided with an economic downturn in Melbourne, a crisis really, crash, and also at the same time his uncle, who had a fairly influential position, lost that position. So perhaps for that reason, Tom wasn't able to get on very well in Melbourne, and it may have been why he decided to enlist in the army. The unit he joined was the 3rd Victoria Bushmen. They were raised especially to take on the Boers in South Africa. So they were raised to fight the Boer War, to take on the kind of, to adapt to the guerrilla tactics of the Boers. And he remained in the army for the remainder of the war. After the war was over, he joined the colonial police in Johannesburg as well. He was involved in a mutinous episode while he was in the army. I won't get into it. And another mutinous episode when he was a policeman, when he refused to shoot a young boy during the Zulu uprising of 1906. Around 1907, with things settling down, the police force was reduced, and he took the opportunity to take the redundancy package. And that was the circumstance in which he became a tramway man. He joined the new Johannesburg tramway service, which was kind of filled out with people like him who had been in the army and police and so on. Soon he became involved in the wider labour movement in Johannesburg through representing his own work colleagues and so on. Is léir gníomhach Tom Ó Flaithearta go Boston, Jerry nídeag a héindeag, tús nídeag a dóideag, níl na cinse fí beidir bhfuil ní romé an an cápéise áil. Cosú leis na Glynns hí star na imirce ag na O'Flahertys, chuaigh uncle amháin ar a laiad den na Ganleys go Meiriceá, agus sílim go raibh uncle eile ar thaobh na Bhleathirteach ina hagart san Astráil, fear a bhí ag plé leis a scríbhneoireacht freisin, a sort of theological history agus a lehéid. Bhí dreifúirithe Tom, Catherine agus Annie, níos sinne nó I Moston River, agus Catherine go háirithe an eicálaach sa pobl Gaelach sa chathair sin. Sa neamhlína solar tháinig Tom go Meiriceá, bhí Catherine ina heifigach lárnach I gréibh Boston de chunra na Gaeilge, agus I gréibh an United Irish League freisin Rooney agus mar sinse den dá drein. Agus I nídeag múnsear Gaeilge I freisin agus eisteoir agus canteoir poiblí. I nídeag agus a ní ag ócáid mór Wobbly I Springfield, Massachusetts, lé Catherine Garscéil a scríb a greithar Tom. Is dótha gur bheith seo cean den na scéalta a dail sí Tom in an Clive solas an bhliain céine. Ní rá sé 7 nó 8 bliain díos ag an amach bhí sé fáilséthe mar a déartha. Nuair a buniú Críomh de Óglaí na hÉireann, the Irish Volunteers, I Moston ribh éirí amach na Cásca, Pau Catherine mar hiisteoir don críomh. Níos óige ná Catherine, bhí baint ag Annie Ó Flaherty leis an gníomhach seo freisin, agus bhí cáil orthaí mar Óránaí. Taréis dó teacht Jerry Tom gníomhnach san ghluaiseacht céine lena dreifúiricha. Ó thuairiscí sa Boston Globe, feicimid go raibh sé féin feicálaach go garaid mar efficeach sa Boston Gaelic School Society, Óglaí na hÉireann agus mar sinse. Maidir le polítíocht na Heitte Clé, tá Féile seán go raibh spéis aige intí, is léir go raibh sé ina bháil den pháirtí sóisialach. Níl Féile se fáte agam go fóil go raibh sé ina bháil den IWW na Wobblies, ach is léir go raibh sé ina gcuideachta. Scríobh sé in 1928 faoi óráid Big Bill Haywood, a Canara den na Wobblies, gur thula sé le linn stáil cáúil I Lawrence, Massachusetts, on the Bread and Roses strike, famous strike, gur thula sé Big Bill Haywood on sin. Is féidir linn tuairimí folitiúil Tomás Amsú timpeall 1950 agus a 60 óna hí canteoirí a thug sé corridómh labhairt den Boston Gaelic Society, Sóisialaí agus comrádaí de James Connolly mar cosú le Con Lehan agus éman amach Alpines. Bíníd na daoine a bhí ag cant ag na cruinnithe den Boston Gaelic Society ag an ná. So tá déanamh 1950, tá draft card ar fáil agus street directories agus mar sin is féidir linn chlí bheithe Tom arena sna blianta sin. Go generalta be posta iad in imirce sé ag brach comisiún. Real estate agent, broker, agent for the Metropolitan Life Insurance Company. Binid na postana a bhí ige. Is ábhar spéise Beiger gur cá James Connolly shall freshen ag obair mar agent than Metropolitan Life Company. Anyway, Liam O'Flaherty's memoir, 2 Years, is interesting for its description of the state of affairs with his siblings when he arrived in Boston around the Christmas to New Year 1920. And what he says is really confirmed by the 1920 census and so on, in terms of how they're all living together. They're in Humboldt Avenue in the Roxbury district of Boston. Catherine appears to be keeping house for the others. She doesn't list an occupation. And she has a few other lodgers, restaurant workers, people who are working with Annie, co-workers of Annie's. Liam gives the impression, or maybe I'm not reading it correctly, that he's kind of a little bit impatient with Tom and the way he's dependent on his, overly dependent on his sisters, and overly beholden on them, perhaps. Liam also writes about Tom's political circle at the time, the James Connolly Club, which he says was composed of people who considered themselves, quote, social revolutionaries, out to spread socialism among the Irish in Boston. For Liam, however, they were philosophers rather than revolutionaries. Rather than being engaged with the workers, he reported, they spend most of their time in conversation, in debate, and in amateur theatricals. We may discern the influence of the Boston Gaelic School Society. They're doing the same kind of things as the Boston Gaelic School Society was. Liam's account finds confirmation in a report in the Boston Globe in mid-January 1920, just after he arrived down from Canada. This was a fundraiser, a description of a fundraiser by the James Connolly Society for a Connolly College in Dublin, which was a trade union initiative in Dublin at the time. One of the features of the entertainment was a crossroads dance in which the participants wore Gaelic clothes. And the named dancers included William, Annie and Thomas Ó Flaithearta at this entertainment. Anyway, during this interlude, Liam was converted to socialism, and Tom encouraged him to take up writing to the extent of buying him a typewriter. He wrote as Wobbly, which he used as a pseudonym, which kind of suggests connections with the IWW. Liam also encouraged Tom to move away from Boston for a time from under the feet of his sisters, as it were. So what about Tom Glynn during this period? I'd just better check my time. Okay, right. Anyway, coincidentally, he arrived in America at around the same time as Tom O'Flaherty, landing in New York on the 13th of January 1912. His arrival in New York was announced, was noted in the Chicago-based International Socialist Review. Comrade Glynn has never been found far from the line of battle in any time of trouble. We hope America will be able to keep him for some time. So cén fá a rocáil Tom Glynn I Meiriceá sular Chuaigh Ellis Island in Anar Nídeag agus Adóiag. Dága mar ré ag obair don Johannesburg Tramway Company, Chimpel Nídeag agus Anní. Is dócha go raibh spéis agus a bolaíocht mar scríb a chomrádaí Archie Crawford mar a leannas faoi san International Socialist Review in Nídeag agus a héindeag tá an píosa sin ar slide an sin. About 2 years ago, this is Tom Glynn now. About 2 years ago, a tall, slim fellow of modest and retiring disposition wearing a motorman's uniform, would sit in some obscure corner of the socialist hall, listening eagerly to the speeches and debates. Only when some faker would propound a fallacy calculated to miseducate and mislead the working class would he stir. Suddenly, as if a bomb were exploded underneath his seat, the quiet, obscure motorman would straighten up his towering frame and, having had his say, as suddenly sit down. Here, thought I, is a true rebel if ever I saw one. Ar dús hosaí Tom ag scríomh litrithe chuig Pauper Crawford, The Voice of Labour, letters to the editor ship. Go garage bhí colún agus sa Pauper, colún rialta, and sin níide agus a héindeag nuair a dá Crawford Johannesburg ar feadh tréimhse, or dó go co-agarthóir an Voice of Labour. Mar cheannar mar éon leis an iriseoireacht seo bhí Tom gníomhach san Industrial Workers Union. Tá an teideal seo tábhachtach ba Meiriceá chuige. Agriocht beg ba seo I Johannesburg. Mar cheanara ar an agriocht seo, dagri sé stalc inad obair féin, an tramway company, agus jairí harbár leis a stalc. Farir bhí stalc eile ar an tramway cúpla míon íor sin, agus nóirí leis, agus brisú go thomláin an Industrial Workers Union, agus for Tom Glynn féin I brísún. Nuair scaoil sire, balg sé an Aifric Theas, sular landáil sé idirnáisiúnta, thug sé cuairt hiag a chláán I nGoirtín. So pléú na stalcanna I Johannesburg sa pápéirí radachacha idirnáisiúnta, mar sin bhí ólas ag daoine I Meiriceá agus áiteach eile faoi Tom Glynn sular landáil sé I nGoirtín. I said the name of Tom's Industrial Workers Union was important or significant. It was an industrial union as opposed to a trade union. The distinction isn't made anymore. But trade unions, in the view of the people like Tom Glynn, did what it said on the tin. They represented tradesmen, privileged workers by and large, whereas the industrial workers set out, the industrial union set out to organise everybody, the unskilled, male or female, regardless of race or anything or anything else. In places like South Africa, people would have been, like Tom and others, would have been introduced to this type of thinking, which is we associate with the Chicago movement, the Wobblies, the IWW, through papers like the International Socialist Review that I've mentioned already, which circulated throughout the Anglophone world. Small circulation, presumably, but key people read it. Tom Glynn is certainly in touch with the IWW, with the Wobblies in South Africa, because he spoke at a Wobbly meeting in New York almost after he landed there. From New York, then, Tom rode the rails. I don't know if people are familiar with what that involved. It was, I'm getting free transport at the moment, but this was a form of free transport claimed by free travel claimed by the Wobblies. Essentially, they just hopped on the train, oftentimes hanging under the train. That was called riding the rods, if you were under the train hanging on. So that was how Tom Glynn went across America. Incidentally, there's an account of Tom Flaherty doing the same in the Midwest. So they had that much in common as well. In this journey, he was in the company of Frank Little, who was a partly Native American, who was the most radical of the Wobbly organisers in America at that time. He would be lynched for his trouble in Butte, Montana in 1917 and became a kind of a martyr alongside Joe Hill at the time. And when Tom Glynn left America, left via Canada for Sydney, he was every bit as radical as Frank Little, convinced, for example, of the necessity for workers in dispute to use sabotage as a tactic, which was controversial even in the industrial workers in the Wobbly movement. Trying to shake things up in Sydney, he caused a split in the Wobbly movement there, with himself prominent in the most radical faction. And when the Australian Wobblies established a new paper in January 1912, Tom Glynn was its editor. It was called Direct Action, which again is a reference to sabotage. It doesn't, sabotage in the meaning of the time is somewhat different to what we might understand now. And maybe it could come up in the questions, but I can't get into detail on everything. So effective, so it didn't attract too much interest, this movement, until war broke out in August 1914. There's a lot of patriotism whenever war breaks out, so a lot of even people skeptical and opposed to the war were fairly circumspect in expressing their opposition, but not Tom Glynn and not Direct Action. So they were the most forthright opponents of the war from the very beginning, defied censorship and so on. So it started to grow and to attract thousands of people to its meetings as conscription, the aftermath of Gallipoli, terrible butchery that happened there, and also with the threat of conscription in the draft in 1916. So in order to get to find, I suppose, villains to oppose the government, arrested the leaders of the Australian Wobblies, 12 of them. The Sydney 12, they were known as. Interestingly, in light of the fact that Tom O'Flaherty was later allied closely with Jim Larkin in America, one of Tom's comrades in the Sydney 12 was Peter Larkin, who had arrived in Sydney in 1915, the brother of Jim. Tom and they were eventually released. I can't get into the detail as to how this happened, but the campaigns for their release made the Sydney 12 a kind of a cause célèbre throughout Australia. And when Tom emerged pale and thin from hunger and weak in 1920, he was recruited immediately by the new Communist Party. This is something that had changed in the period while he was in jail. The Wobblies had been repressed in Australia. They had been repressed in the United States. People like Tom Glynn in particular began to rethink what we were doing is not the right way to do it. Perhaps these Russians know how to change the world. So for that reason, they were open to the idea of joining the communist movement. So Glynn stepped out almost immediately with his freshly acquired French and everything else, was recruited. He was a founder with Peter Larkin. The small group, I think 17 people, met to establish the Australian Communist Party in late 1920. He was one of them, and he was the one they selected to be the editor of the Australian Communist, to spread the new gospel, as it were. So evidently he sought some sort of a blend of what he had been advocating, industrial unionism and communism. Found this difficult in the communist movement, which was a bit doctrinaire and demanding a degree of orthodoxy. Didn't like people making it up as they went along, as it were. So anyway, he found it difficult to kind of have his way as editor. And he resigned, and sometime afterwards, not that long afterwards, he revived the paper that was banned in 1916-17 when he went into jail. The communist movement attracted interest from a number of radical factions, and the Australian movement was very fractious initially. As a result, the Communist International, when that was established, started knocking heads together and making all the people claiming to be communist parties join the one organisation. This would happen in the States as well as in Australia. So bhí sé mar a géana Meiriceá áit tháinig an chuid is mó den na Cumann ar dús ón páirtí sóisialach. Bhí geilt an páirtí a bheith Tom Páirteachán. Bhí geilt an faoi cuasaí stratéiseach I measc na Cumann. Agus mar gheallar sin bunaíodh gá páirtí Cumanach as an gá drám a dág an páirtí sóisialach. Ghlach Tom Flaherty leis an Communist Labour Party, ceann den na communist parties as well. In éineacht le daoine eile mar James P. Cannon, John Reid, Jim Larkin, a bhí hála an am, agus an Larkinite Jack Carney. It was in the communist milieu that he won distinction as a journalist and as a columnist, but evidently his apprenticeship was in Irish-American leftist circles. According to Lawrence White, who wrote the short biographical piece on him, he assisted James Larkin when he launched an American edition of the Irish Worker, 1917. These were difficult years for radicals. The Wobblies were repressed, as I said, and after the war there was a Red Scare, including the Palmer raids of 1919, 1920, in which thousands of communists, anarchists and other radicals were arrested and were deported if they weren't native-born people. Among those arrested were Tom's comrade Jim Larkin, who was convicted of criminal anarchy and ended up in Sing Sing prison. Tom was active in the committee, secretary of the committee to free Larkin, and he was involved in a short-lived paper, The Irish People, which was dedicated to the cause of freeing Larkin. There were difficulties over money, Larkin believing that money raised for his defence was used instead for Communist Party purposes. And one outcome was a souring of the relations between Tom O'Flaherty and Larkin. Tom O'Flaherty was subsequently hostile towards Larkin. He subsequently established another paper called The Irish People under the auspices of an Irish-American Labour League. This ran 1923-24. And its main writers were Liam O'Flaherty and Tom. Tom was editor, and he took credit for some of the articles under his own name, some as the editor, and some as Thomas Ganley, which was his mother's name. It seems the purpose of this was to disguise the fact that there were so few writers, that it wasn't just O'Flaherty's that were writing in the Irish People. So anyway, that's maybe a slight exaggeration, but I can't figure out why he wrote under 3 different names in the same paper. All the while, Tom was writing for the mainstream communist papers, The Toiler from 1921, The Worker, which was a weekly from 22, and The Daily Worker when that was established in 1924. His main contribution was a daily column, As We See It, though the title changed from time to time. It was a satirical commentary on the news of the day, in which he mocked the pretensions of royalty, a favourite target, capitalists, clergy, and so on. It was extremely popular with readers of the Daily Worker, which was otherwise a very serious paper. There was this light relief, and it was so popular, it was on the front page on the left-hand side, so it was the first thing people headed for. It's a little bit obscure now because it deals with the news and the issues of the day, so it doesn't wear very well that journalism, though it was obviously, it was positioned where it was and it ran for so long as it did, because people loved it, to see people mocked. It's striking that he rarely wrote the serious political or economic articles. These were the preserve of the party intellectuals, C. Ruttenberg, Louis Engdahl, and so on. But when the paper produced a weekend magazine from 1926 as a supplement, just like the Irish Times does now, isn't it? Tom had the opportunity then to write longer, serious pieces, which a lot of them dealt with Irish and British politics. So that was probably the height of Tom O'Flaherty's influence, indicated by his presence in Moscow in 1925 and 1926 at meetings of the Executive Council of the Communist International. And of course, he stopped off in Ireland and Britain on the way. Journalistically, he was the founding editor of an important new publication, Labour Defender, which was the magazine of international labour defence, which took up the cases of imprisoned trade unionists and leftists, including such well-known cases as that of the anarchists Sacco and Vanzetti, you know the Christy Moore song, probably, the Woody Guthrie song, indeed, initially. It was a communist initiative, and it was fairly unusual in being kind of broad in its scope. They represented everybody who was imprisoned for a labour cause. They didn't kind of favour their own or whatever else. So Tom's good friend, James P. Cannon, was the instigator here. Now, Labour Defender was well designed with interesting content, and its circulation, according to the Bureau of Investigations, was higher than all the other Communist Party initiatives, publications combined. Arguably, then, it's the high point of Tom's journalistic career, but the job only lasted 8 months, and he lost it following complaints. These weren't bad complaints, but good complaints, because the readership of the Daily Worker wanted to know, where's Tom Flaherty's column? So he was moved back at that stage to the Daily Worker to make it, seem people complained it was dreary without the Tom piece in the front page. So things are becoming strained. I'm overshooting my time now, but I might go another 7 or 8 minutes. Could you handle that? Sorry, just stop. Things are strained in the communist movement following the death of Lenin and the struggle for succession involving Stalin, Trotsky, and others like Zinoviev and Kamenev, indeed, with Trotsky establishing the left opposition. Not long after Tom's return from Moscow in 1926, Trotsky was expelled from the Central Committee of the Communist Party, and he was exiled in 1928. Tom's closest associates in the party, some of their photographs, some of them there from Moscow in one of the slides. These James P. Cannon and Martin Aburn sympathized with Trotsky's position, and they tried to form a left opposition in the American Communist Party. They were expelled in October 1928, formed the Communist League of America, and established a new paper, The Militant. In the third issue of The Militant, in mid-December 1928, I think it's in the slide as well, there appeared a prominent piece announcing that Thomas J. O'Flaherty, quote, the most popular communist propagandist in America, had issued a statement supporting the Russian opposition and expressing his solidarity with those expelled from the party for expressing similar views. This, of course, meant he was expelled himself from the Communist Party and removed from his job in the Daily Worker. He was expected to be a regular contributor to The Militant, this new paper, and in his obituary in the same paper 8 years later, he is claimed as a committed member. His sister Annie wrote from Oran to the paper, indicating he's still identified with the opposition and with the Trotskyist movement, which now styled itself the Workers' Party of America. I haven't found evidence yet, anyway, of close involvement with the militant. Of course, he may have contributed under a pseudonym. Tá fine seán ach go raibh sé go raibh bainteag I báipéir le báipéir eile ó nídéag fiche ní amach sé siúd The Producer's News. Bunaithe ag feardar bhenim Charles Taylor I Blentywood, Sheridan County, Montana, áit iargúlta in Eccletour in Canada. Bhí an páipéir an non-partisan league agriocht ferimóra sa cantar sin a bhí cadrih láidir ige leis an Bártaí Cumanach. I lár na ficheada, bí an Bártaí Cumanach I bhail ar fad I Sheridan County, the sheriff, the senator and the councillors. They were all Communist Party members. So bhí Tom Cardúil let Charles Taylor, bhí sé Blentywood sa lár na ficheada ag tuairt óráidí agus nuair tá Taylor mar seanadóir stáit tháinig deagraí Tom on Producers News ina áit. An sin in idirg trocha héin, ghlach sé tionscnamh eile, páipéir eile, The Wasp. Irish ear folitiúil a bhunaigh sé Cleveland, Ohio. So seo léirmheas ó páipéir Trotskyist, the class struggle. A long felt need, agus tá slide sin freisin leis an píosa seo. A long felt need in the communist movement has been filled by the publication of the first issue of The Wasp, a satirical magazine. It is edited by Tom O'Flaherty, considered by many the foremost satirist in the movement. The weakness of the magazine is that it is not tied up with any branch of the communist movement. It's not joined up with the class struggle. Another danger is a vulgarizing problems faced by the workers by writing in a light vein. It should be obtained by those who want a relaxation from economic and political literature. It's also a great tract to give workers just becoming aware of the class struggle. So not a resounding kind of recommendation. Bin an tonscnamh Jeranach Tom O'Flaherty I Meiriceá, ní labhraí mé ar an téireach mar tá ná ar an dá leabhar a bhí idir lámha ag Jerry Hill, tá níos mó ólas ag éaman ar rud sin. Cad faoi Tom Glynn, dá go mar ré mar eagarthóir ar an Australian communist. Dar nói níor aithrí sé a thuairimí go hiomláin agus rinne sé iireacht an cumanachas agus an syndicachas an bheasca le chéile. Bhí deacreachtaí eile ann, factionachas agus a leithid. Tar éis timpeall sé bhí deir sé as an eagarthóireacht san Australian communist, ach lean sé rá le iireachtaí an syndicachas a chur chun cín sa Pártaí Chumanacha. So thuaidh sé sa fada le áfhónú direct action in idirg fiche dó. Ní fada na dhíth sin deir sé tin. Is dótha margheall ar a ceire bhliain a chas sé sa chóras uafásach príosún san Astráil. So bhí deacreachtaí economica agus mar sinne. Bhí sé ina luach dar nói don ghluaiseachtaí an Locht Obair san Astráil, agus mar sin deagraíú bailiúcháin náisiúnta dó. Leis an méide bailiú cheanna sé taxi. Ach bhí iomaíocht láidir ó cólacht nua taxis, na yellow taxis, agus hep ar Tom Glynn leis an taxi. Ar feadh 7 nó 8 mbliana ó lár na ficheadaí go deireadh a híl bhí sé sin, gan a bheith anán a leaba Ollscoil fiú. Thosa sé scríomh column sa Labour Daily, Party Fópéir on Party an Lucht Ibre in New South Wales, Bishop Party Jack Lang, Far Cossul Jeremy Corbyn, Beiger. A bhris own Australian Labour Party is sort of party in offsplach of Vion. Leanne Tom ag scríomh Altanna Láidir so sílach. A bhí granmhar gomininic cuasaí an economíochta agus idirnáisiúnta go dtí nídéag agus trícha dó nuair nach raibh sé in an. He was totally paralysed for 2 years at the end of his life. So, to conclude then, we've traced the lives of the two men who left the west of Ireland, driven out by lack of employment at home. Their backgrounds somewhat different. The O'Flahertys arguably were more politically and culturally engaged, as far as we can see. Both were parts of a pattern of chain migration, like people from all parts of the world from at that time, from Asia as well as Europe. But they both had elders settled at their destinations. They came in different ways to radical politics, but both were kind of reacting to an intensification of exploitation, whether in the textile mills of Massachusetts or in the mines of the Witwatersrand. They found calling as Labour journalists, highlighting injustice and in both cases denouncing, mocking, ridiculing the exploiters and their allies. Eamon has calculated that Tom O'Flaherty wrote for 11 publications as editor of several of them, the Labour Defender, the Irish People and so on, and de facto editor in a number of cases like the Producers' News. Glynn was editor of Direct Action in Sydney and the Australian Communist, and of de facto editor for a period of the Voice of Labour in Johannesburg, a columnist for the Labour Daily, and his writings were syndicated or copied by papers internationally, indeed. Both had humorous and hard-bitten style, which made them brilliant satirists. That's why they remained in demand even after the political kind of winds changed and they lost their kind of connections. I don't think they met, but if they did, it was perhaps it could have been at that moment in 1912 when they were both in the same in that part of the world. There were indirect personal connections. I mentioned the Larkin connection. Peter connected closely, a close comrade of Tom Glynn, and Jim, a close comrade for a period of Tom O'Flaherty. If there are similarities between, there are also differences. One I'd point to is in relation to Ireland. Tom O'Flaherty, as we saw, was active in Irish American organisations from which when he stepped off the boat. During his most active years, though this would change in his later column, but during his most active years, Glynn didn't really deal with Ireland at all, or Irish affairs. Perhaps this is related to their family background and the way they were raised. With regard to the 1916 Rising, we can assume that Tom O'Flaherty was favourably disposed to it. He was in the volunteers in Boston and so on, though I haven't any contemporary writings about it. Tom Glynn was critical of Connolly in particular for cooperating with nationalists as he saw them. This was against the spirit of internationalism. So Glynn wasn't unusual in this respect. If you see some of the papers, American papers that James Connolly would have been written by people James Connolly would have known while he was in America, the Masses and all these papers. They had took a similar line to Tom Glynn in Australia. With regard to, I think of the two, I would say Glynn was the more doctrinaire. Indications that Tom Flaherty was more open, even in terms of the way he advocated farmer, labour type organisations at a time when it wasn't all the rage, say, within the movements he was involved with, and that we can relate to his background here. Of course, they were both. There were things we can't go to. They were both married men. Several times in the case of Tom Glynn, he was married in South Africa and in Australia. So the activism and its impact on their families and so on. Molly Glynn's record of his talks says that her father was always preoccupied with things, that he was lovely, gentle, kind man, but he was always, his mind was always somewhere else. Anyway, I better not continue any longer. Okay, thank you.
Right, Grumile Magad John, Shin Sarfis Conte, agus go leor taide to here home or topic in the Vince Féile cursi style agus leor agus paper. Vi sé har of a special agus hope to lear more all the shibes an loch the rini in Shin. Fui Georg ne had to heal the Beirt. That was a very extensively researched paper. I think you'll agree that John has provided us with a lot of information about these two people, and I think as it went on, I hope people found that there were these two Toms had a lot of similarities. Their careers may have happened in different places, but the parallels between them and the way that they were making their way in the middle of all these upheavals, such as the First World War, the Communist movement, the Russian Revolution, the establishment of the communist parties, the split between the Leninists and the Trotskyists and so on later on, that the two of them, that there's an awful lot shared between the two. I'm sure people have some questions. One other thing I would add about that is that one trait which I find nice about the two of them both had a reputation for being humorous. I think it's a good thing in particular when we're talking about politics to keep a sense of humour. And both were also very highly regarded as writers. They were the best. And that was exactly what was said about the newspaper that Tom founded in Ireland when he got back in 1934, that it was highly thought of because of its lively and critical tone. That's exactly the same characteristics that we find, I think, in his writing in America. And John has been looking at some of those journals. I think there's a lot more research that he's cast a light on there. That we could go looking for articles of Tom's and so on to see I would suspect the huge extent of articles that are out there still that we haven't we've hardly begun to gather and to assemble and to get an overview of what he was writing.